Yeah, I'm gonna do a quick video note here. The thing with this is that, like I had mentioned, um, how true it is about the software on the Apple iPhone. It's identified as AT&T. I'm not really sure if I should really believe anything about it or what the deal is. It seemed to be my thoughts about the software looking like Apple iPhone SE, yet the Apple iPhone 6S. It seemed to be like an ongoing deal with like um, what the deal is about a VPN as compared to maybe a podcast. And yeah, I just had a deal with like Wells Fargo. It's getting to the point that even really have anything to do with the bank is ultimately getting to whether or not if a president of a bank or an entire like network of international banking systems is actually using what would be termed as an easement of you know whether or not if the category of money itself is just the alphanumerics of 72, or defining the meaning of itemizing it beyond categorization into like the U.S. dollar, vice versa, or if it's really the deal about the you know you have to think about whether or not if discrimination would only suggest a degree level of opportunity, or if discrimination in the way of prejudice would be the deal about the below business and corporate law that way. If just the terminology of social, or what that is to legal tender, and programming in that way of what legal tender suggesting that a note is legal tender for all debt, both public and private. I've been like having ongoing issues with like the bank, and really I don't even write checks, period. Previously, like maybe 10 or 15, really longer than that, truthfully so. But the deal since I've been on SSI has been the only real issue. I mean, for like 10, 15 years. And the difference of whether or not if a direct deposit only reflects a checking account. I've actually requested, there for a while, the SSI being the supplemental security, or the acronym. Yeah, all right, yeah. I'm really trying to get that, like VSAT, like a superstar investment. Yeah. Yeah, all right. Yeah. So anyway, like in any case, so like the thing about it is kind of like um the thing about the Apple iPhone 6. I mean, it's been provided as a means identifying like a benefits coverage that is like the like supplemental security income, or what a bank is, and in a way of like whether or not if the card actually was made available as an option, not really even involved with the bank. And really, the thing with this is that really that the card directly, from the United States Treasury. I mean, if it's ultimately getting to, like every bank, and what COVID ID 19 only suggests to like, a method of banking involving the alphanumerics of 72 and money as a categorization, or the accusation of like, it's an identity crisis, or what seems to be the real deal of, if it's really the deal about a method of banking that is like a forfeiture based upon an endorsement, or what the FDIC, you know, uh, I mean, if it's really getting to a podcast or a simulcast deal of like communications, what simulcast really is to maybe a podcast, or what YouTube might even suggest, as compared to maybe like everyone in the entire universe speaks English when they get to Pearland, Texas. Okay, and it's like I just had a conversation with like several people at Wells Fargo. I mean, I hadn't been thrilled quite at all about being even involved with the bank for, I mean, quite some time, because it's continually seeming to be whether or not if a day-based administration, or a president, a governor, or some management, or just some like technologically advanced database administration has access in a way of what comptrolling might only suggest as a department, or what a country might even mean to international banking systems that way of currency, over the categorization of like every money for which they represent as a national, being a an international banking systems issue of like what it seemed to be like the big deal, when I realized something about the international law of having fair use of really it ultimately gets to excess easements in the form of intellectual, and whether property is really the word, or including neither nor, whatever it needs to mean, kind of like whatever the degree of opportunity only means to maybe the equator or an operator, or separation between church and state. It seems to be like the minimum requirement of like Grover Cleveland, 1,000 the U.S. dollar, Grover Cleveland on the US $1,000, okay, as compared to, some religious thing that obviously, ultimately, the in God we trust gets to the 12 Federal Reserve Banks, and some real issue that seemed to be like, in my mind, the 12 tribes of Israel in that way. I mean, ultimately, it seems to be like getting beyond what separation is. And the thing of it is, it seems to be like whether or not if the US dollar, suggesting that the note is legal tender for all debt, both public and private. I mean, it seems to be like an ongoing issue. Well, like me even maintaining, the question of like whether or not if a database administration is going to be, whether a breach of security is just, the accusation of communication, or everyone just acting like they're talking with someone that they are just like, really, I mean, is it really the note is legal tender for all debt, public and private? Does that mean like a registered charity is not a financial attack? A financial attack of international financial management. I mean, is it management that seemed to be whether or not if being, fair use of like non-negotiable, non-transferable itemization under business and corporate law in that way of like neighborhoods in the way of what only, a fictional real estate might only define as a venue or a living quarter of like, a commercial building as compared to, what seems to be the issue with like database administration, or what that really is in banking, or what the currency or current event or current affair, or, what that is to the word relationship. It seems to be like the big deal about what a current event is with live on air. That way of, auditing legal media and deposition, both, likewise in addition, like legal media is like normally identified as normally live on air anyway. Likewise, auditing, it depends on, what auditing really needs to mean, or what duration of, the fact of like intellectual would only suggest a chronological duration. I mean, if it's suggesting the lifespan, or, what a method of banking only means. I mean, it's chronologically, I mean, there's like been, continually, whether or not if accessing or legal tender for all debt, both public and private, has been like an ongoing issue, whether if like, it's going to be like every international banking system, representing Alpha American, Pearland, Texas, or attenuation in the way of a UA and, the Union address, State of the Union address, or some alphanumerics of 192, and all that great stuff about the home theater and like, American Amplified. Ultimately getting to the 192 that's on home theaters. How long it's been on there? I mean, I'm only aware of it, at this point being probably somewhere around maybe close to 8 or 9 years, maybe. I'm not sure if it's even been 10 years since I actually really noticed that. But before, the home theater was like really, beyond the, the hi-fi home, hi-fi stereo system. I mean, I didn't see anything really that even came close to what amplification might only mean to amplifiers itself of power, increasing all the audible decibel range in that way. But the thing with this is that really, as far as like the home theater, I mean, when I actually realized that was like not normally available information, and it seemed to be a combination of whether or not if the presidential administration in beginning, or what that is, in somewhere in the approximation of like 1992 all the way to like I would say probably the year 2000, or some transition between the William Jefferson Clinton administration to like the George Bush. It seemed like to be the real big deal of importing and exporting that way. That would reflect maybe maritime law, but as far as like the commercial paper, that would normally even include what a transcript would be as legal media or deposition in a way, or like what teleprompting is in television, being the alphanumerics 130, or some great stuff about, a piece thing about a quarter, okay? And the thing about piece is like it's 30, okay? And once again, it like gets all the way into the deal about, 30 being spelled out being 100, and 100 being like a quarter, and a bicentennial quarter, and a living quarter. Seems to be the big deal about, 90-degree right angle. Ultimately, this symmetrical, asymmetrical thing about pi r squared, that's actually about, really a symmetrical, asymmetrical issue, like, the radius being used in approximation with the 3.1416, and likewise, the 1416 is like 14 and 16 is like 30 anyway, kind of like piece, and it ultimately gets to, pi r squared being, the method of computing, finding the actual diameter, which ultimately gets to the volume, okay, of cylindrical, yet of a circle, yet pi r squared, obviously, ultimately likewise suggests that the square, or would be, maybe the line would be an invisible triangle or greater or less than sign in the way, of like the the deal about, symmetrical, asymmetrical value of a square representing a 90-degree right angle in that way. Okay, and the pi r squared is just ultimately, the circle about the radius being used to find the actual diameter of a circle. Anything beyond, the flat plane surface, 180 degree, like flat plane surface, like once again, it gets into the isometrics about, actual participation of three-dimensional in that way, being the volume, okay, and all that, it's like going on. It's kind of like, what the deal is. It seems to be like, what's the deal with like someone actually claiming that there's an issue like manufacturing a need for management on just a simple direct deposit for SSI has turned into like ongoing repeated. It's kind of like, you gotta be kidding me. Like the liquidal equity, or there's like an issue of like whether bartering trading is only the accusation of some podcast, simulating some ideology of like maybe what a sole proprietorship might mean in space exploration, in some parallel universe of like, whether or not if space exploration is only imitating like a VPN of a vice president network itself, or Northrop Grumman representing some ideology of a podcast being something about simulating some like night vision and shadow government of like a auditing like legal media and deposition, and if it's like a release of obligation of a presidential administration to have that in that way, to disregard maybe participation as the one pronoun that cannot be used as a subject of proper English grammatical composition. Like space exploration is like not the deal about being amphibious or like, beyond the baptism or beyond the front lines of the beach around a maritime law, or some amphibious reality about being airborne, some symbolic representation on the backside of the US dollar bill representing the airborne, ultimately getting to the stars born thing, the alphanumeric value of that symbol in between the C and the PTIS, okay? It's kind of like I just got off the phone with, like, and it's been like going on for like, a very long time. And I've made calls, and ultimately, it seems to be like, that actually accomplishing, anything really getting done is seemingly going to be whether or not if, all that good stuff is only, just a network of, maybe presidents and vice presidents, or, Northrop Grumman, or like Lockheed Martin, or, some like podcast of some like shadow government representing some color code of what Vernon State of Texas means and constitutional law, or what ratifying and codifying only maybe might suggest is old-time law, not even meeting the requirements of like legal media, or even the mayor's office in a way of like proclamations and declarations, at the front lines of business as compared to going a little bit beyond what would be normally that, involving corporate law, and what that is in venue, or what that really means in 1200 Reserve Banks beyond some ideology of municipality. In that way, or whether municipal annuities is only the thought of like, the note being legal tender is all that public and private, like intellectual property, is only managing maybe a neighborhood, or some ideology of like a name and an identity, or some accusation that if you can't afford an international law firm, a television will be provided, or the accusation of like management, like a release of obligation through default or neglect based upon lack of experience would only maybe suggest maybe claiming management in space exploration, whether or not if networking is ultimately getting to the issue of like internet protocol, or what that is, really whether if a sole proprietorship is only a silent partnership that designate maybe the individuality of like whether gravity is like really the issue in space exploration, or some amphibious deal about J. Edgar Hoover and some hovering aspects of like like being like within the venue of like the atmosphere, or for real, or I've even talked to like Northrop Grumman. A little bit upset about like Northrop Grumman having a website, okay, and I've seen it, and I've looked at it, and my thing about talking to several people, like, really wasn't a problem about them talking about the website, but there was a person on the phone, and it's ultimately getting to whether or not if a network is like suggesting that Northrop Grumman like has people answering the phone and networking, or what switching and routing means to a rural route, or the history of an address, beyond like the county road, or the rural route, or a lane, or a street, or a boulevard, or an avenue, seems to be like ridiculously something about, Cisco and some like, my ass making it to the finish line, beyond like switching and routing of like stacks of hardware, defining what an internet protocol only means, possibly the history of a mailbox, okay? Or what a street has been, or a county road has been, or a rural route. It seems to be like really ridiculously like almost like a checking account. And the way, and continually, I mean, that has actually happened to me. Having an account number that stayed the same, according to I may have been actually believed a ridiculous issue, like believe what I was told at the bank, that it's the same account. It looked that way, like on the website of Wells Fargo, but it's not like the first time, okay? But my switching my routing number had been changed on my freaking excuse me, excuse me, the checking account. I mean, I don't even really like having anything to do with the bank anymore because of like the accusation of the bank even denying or even accepting or even acting like it's a reality or like they're going to even be able to control their own circuits and what that means in networking and current residency and degree like above the categorization of money or what a name and identity means, or if that like means somewhere in space exploration that an endorsement only like simulates what the FDIC suggests if it's a registered charity in the form of what a certificate of deposit based upon just commercial paper, or if it's like a forfeiture neglect based upon lack of experience, or even like the FDIC not even having a claim to even attach like the U.S. dollar based upon it being in category, but having a name and identity geographically, whatever it needs to mean, I mean, obviously, even like it seems to be like even the United States Treasury of comptrolling will like allow like currency of like multiple international banking systems that speak different languages from hence they have come, okay, and speak English perfectly fine. I mean, everyone in the entire universe speaks English in Pearland. It's like, did you just find out you were speaking English, man? I mean, is that like the courtesy of like, some like Y2K technologically advanced climb the corporate ladder and the Statue of Liberty, some Y2K technologically advanced legislation, or, like what? I mean, for real, and it's ultimately getting to whether or not if like the euro dollar and everything I've said on YouTube, based on, just, what I have to say, not that I really actually seem to be anything more than, actually including whether or not if the United States Treasury is only even using comptrolling as a method of like whether or not the international banking systems is having fair use of the U.S. dollar in the form of like granting allowances of tolerance, or what that is in litigation or de facto, or what it really is, whether comptrolling is really only a method of like somewhere in between the FDIC and like an endorsed check or a daily standard transaction to the bank in the form of like a available closed caption for the hearing impaired. Or what it really is in like legal media in the way of like Sarbanes-Oxley. Once again, seems to be like more and more like what I've been talking about. It's not really like not what I'm trying to talk about, but really, really, I mean, ultimately, it seems to be whether or not if importing and exporting, it's like providing the means of fraudulent issues that might only reflect whether or not the standard practice is only a method of like gee um, what is it the part about that oh man, there was something about it. Anyway, yeah. So it's kind of like a standard of like a method of banking of whether or not if an endorsement would be the accusation of a DBA. That's where I was going with like a DBA, and most people like the employee normally don't see themselves like that at a normal anything other than a database administration or the acronym DBA, doing business as it has been taught as a paralegal. Not that it's been identified as something that hadn't been approved of the mayor's office, or like ratifying and codifying old constitutional law in the form of like color code of like Burn State Texas statute annotated, or whether something beyond maritime law of liquid equity has made it to at least to the surface of like surfing the web, surfing the internet, internet protocol, or whether or not if like commerce is dictating what's on or offshore that way, or like auctioneering, clearance, and warehousing based upon whether or not if a lifestyle is thoroughly chosen as to experience like every possible financial transaction known to mankind in the entire freaking universe, of like every money, currency, money, comptrolling, annuity, or forfeiture based upon total idiot's fee of like not knowing the difference, or maybe the accusation of like just simple alphanumerics in 140 in Pearland, Texas, or what UA means to like a State of the Union address, or the UA being 22, U being 21, and A being 1, being 22, and the FDIC, or what that is to attenuation, or the State of the Union address that way, or I mean, for real, what's the deal with Wells Fargo? I mean, is that like presidential administration, or on behalf of, be it like podcast, and in the form of like Northrop Grumman as a color code of Earned State of Texas statutes annotated, or Roe v. Wade in the way of like Y2K, or I mean, is that supposed to be like like the 94 thing about spirit of adoption, or abortion, or what's the real deal about the real deal about the note is legal tender for all debt, both public and private. I mean, what's the deal about it? I mean, is that it's on the front side of the U.S. dollar, or is it the back side, or is it like is that the transparency about the deal about PG-13 rating between a presidential governor issue, or maybe even Los Angeles, or the 109 thing about Los Angeles and the alphanumerics of for it is written, or the governor is president, and 109 is 110, or geoprism. The geoprism is geoprism thing about the alphanumerics are 247, and it seems to be like going on and on. How like it seems like the book of the secret symbol, how the Federal Reserve runs the country, and the deal about during the Reaganomics, how he called the New York Federal Reserve Bank president, which is identified in the book. How true it is, I'm really not sure. Paul Volcker, although it's an alphanumerics of 140, in the book Secrets of the Temple, how the Federal Reserve runs the country, which is the president, obviously, of the U.S. dollar and the New York Federal Reserve Bank. Okay, I mean, it seems to be like the big deal about the U.S. dollar and the 12 Federal Reserve banks, as compared to like what Robert E. Reubin seems to be like my thing about the big deal about the name and identity, and what a registered charity, or a method of banking, or a certificate deposit, or an endorsement, and what the commercial paper really suggests, and whether or not if the FDIC even represents or has an option or a multiple choice of what money it actually is designated, and what that is to a country or a county, as compared to a country and a department. I mean, what is it with a department as compared to a country? I mean, it ultimately gets to a nation. I mean, at the point of whether or not if a country is ultimately getting to representing a national money in the form of the euro dollar, or the Statue of Liberty in a way of what legislation means, and legislative, executive, and presidential administration that way. Beyond family law, I mean, the structure might represent some similarities that way. Yeah, I mean, but really in reality, I mean, when it's an administration as compared to a normal daily like routine, I mean, what does it ultimately get into? I mean, the history of a mailbox, and determining whether or not if a method of banking is only whether or not if a mailbox has ever been a rural route, or what switching and routing means to a checking account. In that way, or is it like a manufactured, the note being legal tender for all debt, public and private, and there's like an identity crisis, like in multiple standards, like international banking systems having the international law of having fair use of intellectual easements. It doesn't really define anything other than having fair use, but it's the only deal about really intellectual property, normally in the form of like the value and content, like compact disc, or the information and value of like a motion picture in the form of a DVD, or protected issues that would reflect whether or not if piracy is only the deal about seemingly involving like those two anyway, with like compact disc, normally associated on DVDs about piracy. And the thing of it is that really, I mean, ultimately, I mean, if fraud is only a method of disregarding what liquid equity is in maritime law, I mean, it's only perceived normally that piracy only involves maritime law. Not that anything necessarily of a degree level, of only what opportunity means below, like corporate and business law, in a way of like the word social itself is non-negotiable, non-transferable itemization, like every endorsed check, or the FDIC having an option of whether or not, the FDIC is going to have fair use of even attaching the categorization of the U.S. dollar, or whether or not if it's an option of alphanumerics of, whether, if it's going to be a Texas-Mexico issue, or an equator issue, of a religious issue, or some ideology below the equator, or Latin legal terminology of Latin terminology and legal terminology in Latin, or if that's going to be like the accusation of a religious issue of like of a man, or above the equator of like Jehovah. I mean, it's ultimately getting to the 69 thing, really about it. I mean, and ultimately, the book Secrets of the Temple, how the Federal Reserve runs the country, involving like during the Reaganomics, that he had requested for the New York president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, Paul Volcker. How true it is, really. I mean, at this point, living in Pearland, Texas, and alphanumerics being 140, and attenuation, and all the UA stuff about, 21 and 1 being 22 in the FDIC, or the RCA Radio Corporation of America, or some ideology of like, money being the category of Federal Reserve banks at the highest levels of presidential administration, reflecting whether or not if the comptrolling is really the ideology of like the name and identity and what that is to annuity, or if the FDIC only suggests what maybe commerce only dictates what's on or offshore, if that actually is a prejudice of you know not identify and like a commerce dictating what's on or offshore as a method of banking in the form of like boycott and embargo, or what that is to the absolute values. I mean, for real, of like what pi r squared is to like exponential quotients and the three axes of Audi, or what the absolute values of algebra going through all the way through calculus, and that word algorithm being introduced with the absolute values. I mean, if it's ultimately getting to really ultimately what that is to the barcode, or what an embargo is to the barcode, or what commerce dictates what's on or offshore as internet protocol, from city municipalities, or what the real deal is about proclamations and declarations, or what the mayor's office is with business, if at all, claiming any municipal jurisdiction in a way of like corporate venue, based upon like what a real estate fixture a fixture is in venue as compared to like a residential area, as a living quarter as compared to maybe what an endorsement might only suggest through neglect based upon lack of experience, because most people in a bank normally just sign what they might even ignore as an endorsement, or maybe the accusation of a forfeiture. I mean, many people might not be aware that maybe having fair use of an endorsed check with a name and identity, what that is in under business corporate law, is a social issue of like non-negotiable, non-transferable itemization. Like escrow is like the issue of getting paid for actually forfeiting as some consolation of like settlement in a toilet. Okay, and ultimately it's getting to whether or not if legal tender, or the note being legal tender, is only the accusation of communication of teleprompting. Is it really teleprompting, or is it like whether or not if a wireless phone, or the history of a mailbox is only suggesting a rural route would only identify what a checking account is in a bank anyway, or the history of like communications, or whether a landline is only reflecting whether or not the awareness is even like a reality, or like some retroactive stuff based upon having use of like of a compact disc from the 80s, or or what that is to Sarbanes and Oxley. And Sarbanes seems to be the deal about the bars. Sarbanes, Sarb, the bars, Sarb, bars, yeah, Sarbanes, yeah. I mean, if M is in, and it's the aim, and aim high, the aim, M is in, and the bars, aim, the direction of like the Lincoln Continental, the rectangle being the deal about night vision of like Abraham Lincoln and the Lincoln Continental that way, or what computer programming is to the kernel, ultimately originating from like the name Lincoln itself, getting to once again like as American as hot dogs and apple pie, deal about the kernel and the kennel, or the next of kin suggesting a categorization of family structure is only whether or not if a white collar executive is involved at a municipal level of the mayor's office, identifying what proclamations and declarations is in the mayor's office of business, or whether or not if the Better Business Bureau is only ever going to be any reality of like the alphanumerics of 70, or like Vantage, or what Vantage Club 30 score, soon to be like the score of a secret de facto, which is normally termed as like corporate terminology involving litigation. Yet at the same time, I mean, why a U.S. patent is not like copyright or really trademark, but I mean, if it's ultimately getting to that actually happening with everything other than like the terminology of it itself, or what the freedom of speech and freedom of press means to copyright, yeah, in the form of like the notice legal tender for all debt, both public and private. I mean, if it's ultimately getting to the original authenticity of like by the authority, I mean, is it that an endorsement only is a release of obligation, like a defector forfeiting like their own name and identity as a defector, as a release of obligation of like their own identity as a DBA, or fraudulent standard practice identified as an acronym as a DBA, doing business as compared to a database administration? I mean, ultimately, it seems to be like really quite a bit about the crap of a method of banking, of legal tender being, the note being legal tender for all debt, both public and private. I mean, I'm really getting tired of even having any kind of problem with any kind of bank account. Any bank, including Wells Fargo, or what Chase is. Chase is everywhere you want to be, or what Wells Fargo is. I mean, like, gee whiz, like, I mean, as well as Fargo, like manufacturing, like, I mean, being within the description of like, I don't know, is that like investment terminology of like, Wells Fargo's like everywhere you want to go, you can't leave your toilet. I mean, what the hell? I mean, is that some presidential administration, to international banking systems having fair use of a name and an identity in a way of what Pearland, Texas means to alphanumeric or attenuation or purple heart or, the list goes on and on about, some holy miracles, and all that good stuff, right? All that heaven sent stuff that, really sounds, that's all it needs to sound like. It's like, that's all it needs to do is sound like good, right? That's all it needs to do is sound nice, right? Well, anyway, it's kind of like having all those issues. And now it seems to be like whether or not it's ultimately getting to Geneva, Switzerland of the summit meetings. And what it really means to, all that going through a circuit. And what that is, above during and getting above during business and corporate law and getting above it, like going through the circuit of international banking system. Most people might not see, a state things about having the right to assemble as, why the Fifth Amendment is not a nonprofit organization. Or a silent partnership suggesting a sole proprietor is really not the issue, or is that really, a VPN of a vice president network, even of any, via plenipotentiary network, using a podcast in the form of like what? Legal media, a deposition in that way? What is that, like a sole proprietor in space exploration of silent partnership, a podcast representing a black color code of space exploration? Or is there like need for like the atmosphere being within the grasp of like, some alphanumeric value of like MSN and NSM and 14 and 13, all that 55 stuff equating to the sky in heaven? I mean, is that all that means in Sarbanes and Oxley and financial instruments is a bicentennial quarter and Roosevelt and about the New Deal Act involving the FDIC in a way of like a pi r squared seems to be the real big deal about exponential quotients of like variables of power and multiplication that way. I mean, at the degree, right? So anyway, so like, really, I'm really, yeah, I mean, is it the lighting? Really? I mean, should I maybe, maybe, maybe soften up a little bit, maybe a more presentable, welcoming, parents, maybe more in a pastel. Yeah, so like anyway, so like there seems to be like the real big deal about a drum major in major universities involving, fine arts and humanities that way, beyond the abstract and satire, in a more presentable, maybe color coordinated, presentable, welcoming, color arrangement of a pastel, right? All that computer literacy of, comparable scientific notation being beyond, the class of the times and the fortune cookie and some ideology of like orientation of, the question of like the fine arts and humanities of a drum major going, hey, the absolute Christianity now, I mean, hey, is that invisible anchor glowing in dark toilet paper? I mean, for real, okay? Or what that is to Cisco, a switching and routing. I mean, if it's going to be a rural route issue, a switching and routing and what banking is to a checking account, or if it's going to be the Cisco of toilet paper or the Cisco of like networking of communications. I mean, really ultimately get into whether or not if business and corporate law is maybe only managing what having fair use means as an international law of access easement of intellectual property. I mean, if a name and identity is only a social security issue of like non-negotiable, non-transferable itemization of a name and identity as a method of banking, or the accusation that every endorsed check is a DBA practicing a fraudulent method of banking by endorsing their own check and not even realizing that they're accused of being, database administration, fraudulently, doing business as like their whole entire employment history has been like a freaking ass lie. Okay? Yeah, so, all that good stuff about, business law and, methods of banking and international financial management of saying software and storage area networks, all that good stuff, about increasing name and value, name and identity, and all that, praised value, what commerce dictates what's on or offshore. Whether or not Sarbanes and Oxley only reflect maybe what an embargo might mean in maritime law, or boycott in a way of what, that might only suggest as, I'll actually have to think about that. What is that? Boys automatically, 42, then 45, 55, and 60, 80, and 100. It's like 100, I think, if I'm not mistaken. It's one of the words I normally don't even think of. But I think it is 100. I mean, it's ultimately get into the quarter, in a bicentennial quarter, like again, or, the hospital, or, what boycott is to, in that way, or, some real facts about, what it is in tariff that way, but, an entrance exam only means to like a 200-mile barrier. I mean, if it's really ultimately getting to internet protocol And, I just mentioned a little earlier today about, surfing the web and what that is to internet protocol. And I just mentioned it, really a little bit earlier about that seashell. I mean, I just happened to be fortunate enough to have an iPhone to begin with. But the thing with this is that I've had an iPhone SE. Yeah, I was sent one because of benefits of Medicaid and like food, SNAP supplemental, nutrition assistance program, and SNAP identified in the form of like the Lone Star card. Or is there like an issue already suggesting that International Financial Management has a claim as borrower's terminology as a Lone Star? I mean, is that like the flag? I mean, or like really? I mean, or is that like what legal tender means to all that both public and private? I mean, is it really ultimately getting to, the deal about the deity or, the proper English grammatical composition of first, second, and third person between the I, myself, I, me, myself, I, myself, and me, whatever. Me, myself, and I, or whatever. Anyway, yeah, so whatever, you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, yeah, so I mean, ultimately it gets to whether or not if the reality is going to be whether SOX compliance is only suggesting a 90-degree right angle of a baseball field. And ultimately, it's not limited to, SOX compliant, or if that's going to be the real deal about, whether or not if the baseball field is only the issue of like a symmetrical, asymmetrical value of a radius of what that is to symmetrical and asymmetrical of a radius would be normally identified as a circle, pi r squared, and find actual circle, diameter of a circle using, the approximate as close as, a supposed given is as a radius with, 3.1416. Okay, and ultimately the 1416 is like 14, 16 is 30, and 30 spelled out is like 100, okay? I mean, if that's the boycott about the pi r squared, or, through neglect based upon lack of experience, not knowing the thing about the national security or the baptism, or, going beyond the front lines of the beach run of maritime law and getting something about J. Edgar Hoover and hover and what J. Edgar Hoover is the amphibious thing about it. I mean, it seems to be like really more and more, what the FBI suggests some African Americans involving, 78, the zip code, a heart god, escrow. I mean, this goes on and on, and what that is to an escrow god, or an ERISA god, or a VPN god, or what electronic god is to the African Americans of 130 of Washington that way, or electronic god and television that way. What 130 is, like the word 30 and what that is to peace. And ultimately, it seems to be the big deal about, the Zion thing about the 1,000 years of peace, okay? And I've been focusing quite a bit on that, about the operator being, 0 and 64 and HTTP :// that way, and what Zion is to the 1,000 years of peace. And it seemed to be the presidential administration beyond Abraham Lincoln, the two syllables being 22 and 22 of Abraham. It seemed to be like one of the only names at this point that seems to be the syllable of what Abraham is really, in a way of like a V-twin and a thermocouple semiconductor, and Sarah biblically, and Abraham and Joseph that way. And I haven't really got other than the thought of like steeplechase being involved that way, suggesting what that is to a pilot, in a way, even a religious issue, or what that is to the secrets of the temple, or what that is to a pilot in a way of direction or accuracy. The affirmative action deal, normally the word affirmative is normally a pilot's word for absolutely as accurate as possible based upon, a pilot's terminology being supposedly the accuracy of the Air Force. Yeah, so I mean, ultimately the affirmative and affirmative action seems to be like the real big deal, whether or not if that's going to be J. Edgar Hoover, something about amphibious, or, the psychic warrior, okay? Or the book cover, like the guy under the water representing, the psychic warrior, America's foremost psychic spy. And the cover-up of the top secret CIA Stargate program. And once again, the cover-up is automatically like the thing of like June 14, 1992, as far as, my thing about, a baptism, okay? And what Flag Day is on Saturday, SAT. And obviously what has happened, really after that, going through a circuit, and whether demanded participation is only the idiocy of like really not, like really like on it, or like really aware, or or really believe in anything other than, what they themselves want to believe about it or know about it. So, I just decided, to be my own executive that way, going through it and making the best of, my thought of what having the right to assemble means going through the circuit, or what the freedom of press means, or, having the right to assemble, or the accusation of that, you know, not meeting the requirements of a degree, but only what opportunity only means to, if it ultimately gets to UN sanctions and NATO, North Atlantic Treaty, or the peace treaty, being the 30, the peace thing about, 30. Yeah, and some reality about some alphanumerics of the map being 30, Bible, baby, and there's a lot more about, the 30 thing in the pie chart, and what that is to pi r squared in pronunciation as compared to the spelling of PIE, and what pi is with PI in that 3.1416, and what that is to the 146, and like, the U.S. Secretary of Treasury, Robert E. Reubin, in my mind, being of the tribe of Reubin, biblically, of the scribes, ultimately getting to, in my mind, the invisible programming of like the unseen thing, okay, of like invisible programming that way, of light scribe, beyond light scribe, and all that advanced light year stuff. It actually identifies a name and identity that way. Would maybe be the thought of maybe a forfeiture of someone who doesn't know the difference of endorsing their own employment, or maybe the accusation of the ERISA statute. I've heard the acronym pronounced many different ways, and whether or not if the IRA on a tax form is the only real identity or factor determining whether or not if the acronym of the ERISA statute is only the issue of the alphanumerics of 52 and a heart, or FBI miracle, or what that is to the deal about them, even the VPN, the vice president network, or what a podcast might only mean if it's only involving a sole proprietorship as a silent partnership, and that's really about business law being like one person individually, or if one pronoun, the one pronoun of the four type pronoun that cannot be used as the subject is really the topic, and all that's a bunch of crap, and it's like really happening anyway. And what that means in color code to the Vernon State of Texas statutes annotated, ultimately it seems to be like the deal about Roe v. Wade, or what maritime law means, and not being all airborne about some greatness beyond maritime law, or being all airborne enough to experience something that's claimed to be like a known fact involving alphanumerics defining the U.S. dollar, ultimately getting to stars born, likewise in addition beyond maritime law, even a baptism, and like really if it's ultimately getting to even the deal about a military grade of a SAT, or a flag day representing national anthems, and what flag is like involved with like summit meetings in like Geneva, Switzerland, as compared to what human capital only means because of being airborne, or beyond the endorphin transaction bank, not necessarily accused of being a defector seeking amnesty, or a fraudulent method of practice of endorsing their own entire employment history as a DBA, doing business as a normal daily standard practices transaction in the bank, as fraudulent participation, like it's all void is, and like like it's all fraud based upon an acronym of a DBA, normally representing database administration or network operations that way. What the hell, all that like brain work about, all the experience of like all that heavenly stuff is like, really affecting someone's attitude. What would you expect to hear? At this point, really. The naivety of like, the entire like world involved with like international banking system, what alphanumerics means to Pearland, Texas. For what? Is that what you're looking for? Really, is it ultimately getting to, like, really, is it election year again? Absentee voting, does that include, like, the acronym of the DBA, or forfeiture based upon endorsement, or, neglect based upon lack of experience, or, what does it mean to a DBA? Doing business as, is it like a database administration, investigating what comptrolling is of the United States Treasury, allowing other currencies, or is it really the exact opposite of the United States Treasury Departments? Representing, is it the United States, or is it just a bunch of embassies of international banking systems that just speak English is ultimately what it gets to? Or whether or not the United States is really geographically attached in the U.S. dollar only. Or, what it really means as the United States Treasury. If it goes beyond comptrolling in a way of like controlling maybe what only represents international banking systems of their geographic attachment of their money, having fair use of the U.S. dollar, or would that be the same principle of an endorsed check, in a way of like a substitute, in a way of like a a forfeiture, or what having fair use means to actual a name and identity in a form of like royalties as like an identity and name and identity, or what that means as if like a substitute, like ignoring like what participation means and all that good stuff about or is that the phrase, the Tom Cruise phrase? Hey, good to see you. Wouldn't want to be it. But in reality, it's like, isn't that really what's happening? Or is that like, hey, don't be fooled by imitations or, an incomplete pass, or, because, hey, look at that screensaver. Screensaver, hey, was that like an incomplete pass of like, the Oval Office? Or is it like, the promiscuous color code of the football, suggesting that pi or squared, beyond the color code of the football and the Oval Office, and ultimately getting them like Mount Olives, or some color code of like cop saying, and what the deal is about J. Edgar Hoover, and the color code of the white arch in St. Louis, and the color code of the cardinal, the bird, in a way of like the United States Code's annotated, and the red words of like, the religious thing about Christianity involving the King James Version Bible. Now the deal about the white, the golden arch and the Ark of the Covenant of God, or the pearly gates of heaven, the streets of gold as compared to painting for gold, which is ultimately the deal about, whether or not, if it's only suggesting a hedge fund, of, like a absentee voting, what that is to a penal code, or, what that is to chase ink, or, what the deal is with, like, the sign of circumcision in a way of the alphanumerics of 206, or Brazoria country, or the spirit of adoption, likewise in addition, what that is to a pagan idolatry, like, or not. Or Esco, identifying, the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner, and like Moses and Pharaoh, in that way of a bird, a color code of a bird, ultimately whether or not if Escos were like really the deal about maritime law of Deep Star 6, and ultimately getting to whether or not if night vision of Abraham Lincoln is really the deal about the Deep Star 6 thing, about the movie, and measuring nanoluminance in night vision, if that's the only real deal of whether shadow government is not really night vision in a way of vision. I mean, if shadow government is not night vision, and it's only like the issue of like military time, I mean, is it so broad and expanded that not using every form of information would be only the naivety of like whether it's seen or not is only having the experience of like even knowing, or it even being taught, or even suggested is available in that way. I mean, it's ultimately getting to like Pearland being like, something about, in a way, unlike any other, place in, the entire English-speaking world. I mean, for real, and ultimately, the naivety of so many things, of like even in many degrees, whether they participate in a circuit or not, ultimately gets to whether or not if it's going to be an issue between corporate and business law beyond the mayor's office of like proclamations, declarations, and what that is, to storefronts, or if it's like manufactured in a way of like the note being 54, or de facto in a way of like Vantage, Love 30, or Love being 54, like notes, or the Better Business Bureau in a way of what the business is to 108 in Chevrolet, and a bicentennial issue of an operator ultimately getting to zero, and all the equations of like ACTP colon of computer programming of architecture and platform, and embedding encryption. Ultimately, what the operator is or is not the embedding encryption, and whether or not if opportunity is only what availability means, not limited to the software and hardware and the programming itself, not necessarily ignoring what the implications to embedding would only mean to maybe what a reputable standard of consensual participation would mean to a platform, or embedding in that way of the demanded standard of consensual participation, or what encryption is in the way of whether or not if that reflects any ideology of like I don't know if I would call it patent in a way of relation of what I see as above the equator in the way of an operator, or the separation between church and state with a minimum requirement of Zion being 1,000 years of peace being 30, and the map, the baby, the Bible, and certain factors involving the 12 Federal Reserve Banks, and what in God we trust is to a CEO God, or the white collar executive in a way. I mean, it really, ultimately, what the hood ornament can simply and easily mean, beyond like night vision and Abraham Lincoln. And to me, it's automatically the Lincoln Continental, and what a colonel is to a kennel, or Lincoln, with the same letters rearranged, and still have the pronunciation of kennel, or what the next of kin only suggests whether or not if family law is really the issue. I mean, for real, or what that means to, as American as hot dogs and apple pie, and what that is to a baseball field as compared to a tennis court. Or a marginal spread in a way of terminology, investment terminology, even, of investment firms, likewise, even the New York Stock Exchange. And obviously, I mean, it's ultimately getting to ridiculously that. And, I don't find necessarily, really as a result of, getting involved in after, starting to deal about a baptism. I mean, really, I just couldn't, like, stop looking and, actually found the alphanumerics issue. And really, I mean, when I really got over being impressed, realized, after the U-151 and the 177 minus 26 is 151, the Holy Spirit, Jesus Christ, and Sacred Service, and that, I mean, being impressed automatically, knowing, as a religious issue, I mean, hey, that's really not a joke in the way of alphanumeric. Or, like a telepathic power being 177, or subliminal message that way, or persuasive techniques of thinking, or suggestive, persuasive techniques of, thinking, or, persuasion in a way of a subconscious level, or, what that mental telepathy is, to being airborne, or the symbolic representation, beyond the liquid equity of maritime law, beyond the front lines of the beachfront, or whether or not the sand software is only the representative of the beachfront, whether it's going to be a storage area network, or a securities and annuities network, and what a degree level opportunity means to the degree plan, and whether or not if the degree is participating in the circuit or not, is really ultimately what the acronym gets to about the separation between church and state. And a minimum requirement in my mind, like a Grover Cleveland, the U.S. $1,000, and the thing about Zion, and how the operator represents the equator, or what that is, to a barometric altimeter of condensing residuals. It's like a networking operations terminology and phrase, and it's also the book cover of, Orion performance monitoring, and what the balloon is in the way of a barometric altimeter of condensing residuals suggesting, residential as a neighborhood, not necessarily even a living quarter, not even a venue, even though the television could simply and easily be a venue of whether or not, if it's a breach of national security, just watching it. I mean, really, I mean, that's K television. I mean, it's the same programming as W television. And what the W is to, like, the Abraham, like the V twin. I mean, it's the W ultimately getting to the year 2023. I mean, it is a 23rd letter, yet V and V is like 44. And what that is, really, I mean, is it that the alphanumerics of 23 and W is like really 44? A V-twin thing about a thermocouple superconductor in need of, like, pi r squared, and, the full range of, like, panoramic academia based upon ambidextrous participation, or the South 909 deal about the egg and more from Mork, and what that is to, the egg white and Mugu Gaipan and Hopsing about, the walk, the jaywalk. It's amphibious in a way of what, orientation is to something about, Hopsing. And, yeah, the toilet, that guy thing about, the well blossom, having an inaugural well blossom. I've seen the tennis balls, I've seen the baseballs, and the seemingly so thing about it. Okay, I mean, if it's ultimately getting to the the shampoo being 87 and the truth in a way of what 12 is to a quarterback, and spelled out being 87, and that well blossom thing about shampoo. Excuse me, being 87, the truth of shampoo. I mean, ultimately, if it's getting to being an heir of God, inheriting the king, if the kingdom only represents K television, or ultimately W television, and Fox News in my mind of channel Fox News 29 and Philadelphia represents the deal about the 100 in Benjamin Franklin in that way of like the U.S. dollar, and once again it gets back to the quarter and all the way back to night vision and Abraham Lincoln and the colonel and the R, the country, the county, and Abraham Lincoln, the night vision thing about even, the deal about, Richard Nixon in that way of the V-twin, signifying that he didn't normally mention the word peace, although he always suggested, something about he didn't, although it was like referred to as eavesdropping. To me, I really don't really believe anything about the eavesdropping, other than, something about the Garden of Eden and a religious issue, whether or not if that's really going to be the issue of province. Or what that is really now, it seems to be really the deal about impedance and ambience, what an ohms deal to, like Calamity Jane is to a color code of a clam, or the pearl, Yeah, for real. And the deal about the horseshoe being, the omega, the resistance of ohms, in a way of even color code being like something about something black of night vision in that way. The 8 normally involving infinity suggests, something about space exploration in a way of the infinite lines of the 90-degree right angle, yet it suggests likewise the pi r squared being a factor, identifying the square and the circle, ultimately getting to the two circles and like the 8, and what it is to vertically as an 8 or horizontally on a zoom lens, a perfect 10-10 vision, even in the planetarium, of a star is born type of deal in the planetarium of like a mega, magnification of like the zoom lens in the planetarium in space exploration and astrology. I mean, it's ultimately getting to, what a figure 8 skater is on ice. Being, even wide in that way of like even the Mugu Gaipan without the yoke. And, that Carl Malden stuff about, hey, don't leave home without like American Express. I mean, the deal about Carl Malden seemed to be really about you know, um, don't leave home without it. It's like don't leave home without the egg whites, but you can leave the yolk at home. Seemingly the deal of like the color code of like traffic lights. Yeah, and what that is to, the impedance being the nanoluminance of like pastel red and, the green of like a regular traffic light. Um, being, in world history, it's a pastel green. Although the traffic light is a little bit more saturated and more in depth than like, world history identifying the pastel green or like nanoluminous in the form of LED lights of LED measured in nanoluminance of a pastel green being like even the color code of province in world history, like an executive, all about it. And, the red being, the deal of the pastel roll is still like both night vision. Yet Carl Malden says, don't leave home without it. It's almost like the traffic light and the Mugu Gaipan of the egg whites. And Mork from Mork, and the stuff about 909, deal about, the thermocouple semiconductor and the egg, and, what the deal is with the Oval Office that way. But I thought you were playing football. Or, but really, I mean, is it the permissive color code of football? The Oval Office suggesting Mount Olives and re-entering heaven with some reality about, the tennis court and the baseball field, ultimately getting to a marginal spread and what 2 people on the tennis court is as compared to 4 people, or a hypothetical metaphor, or the symbolic practical application of like sequencing characterization in sets of 4 binary numbers. Using the marginal spread of like terminology, a practical application of integration and compatibility that way, even terminology in the New York Federal Reserve, New York Stock Exchange. Yeah, so, in any case, so, it's ultimately getting to whether or not if, symmetrical, asymmetrical deal about, the 90-degree right angle, also representing the infinite lines, is getting to, what infinity means to the figure 8, as compared to it being placed horizontally. As a plane horizon, like an altimeter would be to an airplane. And what that, barometric altimeter to constant residuals is to the hot air balloon, which is the book cover of like Orion's performance monitoring with all the different colored balloons in the air. It's like the book about the cover. I never looked at it like cover charge is like what, like clubs meant, but the cover charge is like going to a nightclub. Or, thinking of it as like a night vision issue. In any case, yeah, so, ultimately, the cover charge and what the deal is with night vision as compared to that much about it seems to be the deal about infinity. And, what pi r squared is to the square of asymmetrical, likewise, the radius being likewise like a symmetrical, asymmetrical of a line, ultimately, about a circle as compared to symmetrical, asymmetrical deal of pi r squared being like a greater or less than sign, representing an invisible line as a triangle, or 2 invisible lines representing absolute value, or algorithm and algebra all the way through, going through calculus, being alphanumerics of like 92 and Pentagon, reserve reverse in that way, what the Federal Reserve is of 92, or what the U.S. dollar is in reverse would be, maybe not the neglect based upon lack of experience, of increasing name and identity in a different way of an endorsement that wouldn't be maybe a defector seeking amnesty going through a circuit of storage area networks, or what NATO peace treaty agreements mean of circuits of international banking systems, reflecting, what it means for everyone to speak English with a little bit of an accent about it, right? Yeah, so in any case, yeah, so like I'm going like right at it 1 hour right now. It's kind of like I spent a lot of time, really because of baptism and a spiritual experience, and really a Flag Day deal on Saturday. Uh, Not the same day, but yeah, most definitely the thing about June 14th, 1992, and what that is to a Saturday morning, and what that is to a SAT, or ultimately, months later, seeming like, knowing the difference of, how that happened, like, a demanded requirement of participation, whether that's a known or not known fact, or, who's really, in control of whether or not of, only believing would only be, the accusation of, like, knowing the difference. And ultimately, sounding like this would sound like, really going through it is, like, really been, like, seriously not funny, right? So anyway, so, like, international banking systems involving, like, importing and exporting that way of having the right to assemble, whether or not that's the accusation, or whether or not just the assembly itself would only reflect maybe what a banking system of having a right representing international banking systems in the country as compared to the department of international banking systems as a country, or what the Statue of Liberty is to the atmosphere and the 7 layers. I mean, I've seen it both with 7 and 9 layers, okay? I mean, it's like almost like practical application of even what the weekend is to it during the business week, a 5 with a 2, day weekend as compared to, that even involving the atmosphere that way. And what the deal is about the ionosphere being the outer layer, being, something about, the 7, pylon shape. I don't really like calling it spike, but the Statue of Liberty having to deal about the ultimately, it was then the shape more so of a pylon and the telepathic teepee of a Native American Indian, suggesting management was like a mandatory necessity of the uniform, kind of like putting a little bit of civilized, issue of like management in that way. Um, of reservation as compared to a political assignment concern of like implementation, or ultimately my mind of the 13 colonies of American history, reflecting maybe some color code of a plantation in the way of what Commonwealth really in my mind is really it took a stronghold of terminology representing what might represent color code in a way of a plantation, or the color code involving what was normally associated with the word plantation in a way, not necessarily a right to assemble in that way, or what might even suggest whether or not if annotation is a result of jurisprudence, as a result of to accomplish like whatever needs to happen to like to get someone wherever that like needs to be. So I mean, if it's ultimately getting to whether or not the municipality of the mayor's office is only deciding whether or not if auditing legal media um, would only be Sarbanes-Oxley of a financial instrument and the bicentennial quarter in a way of just the word quarter itself, or what that is to a name and identity, or like telepathic brainwaves being like a Chevrolet Silverado deal, or Chevrolet being the operator, like everyone has an operator, has a phone, or maybe the deal about a name and identity, maybe not ever having a clue other than like learn as I go. I mean, I have been such a learner as I go. It's like ridiculously not not really humorous at all, really, with how much I really have covered as far as information. And a lot more than what really I've talked about on my YouTube.com at Wade ASV, pretty PRIDDY. Likewise, in addition, all my newer videos, like I'm talking like right now, on Wade ASV pretty, WADEASVPRIDDY 192, it's like all the new is like specifically me talking on it, yet integrated, not really integrated, but individual as I don't want to really call it isolated or segregated, but truthfully so, yet still placed on the Wade ASV pretty, but they work that way with my new videos, like going through and segregated that way, yet still going to my previous and in coordination that way. Anyway, yeah. So anyway, hopefully I'll get my drum set up and get back to my music videos in that way, and get to it, because it seems to be like really. I mean, I have a lot on my mind, and leaving the bank, and I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, the way things are happening. I mean, it's just so very much not cool. About obviously, how could it not be? Very much about it. I mean, ignoring it would be, actually experiencing, the thing about it, still, or a duration that, if it's ultimately getting to what a UN sanction is to like circuit as compared to what venue of like participation only means is a duration, is intellectual. And what that means to like governance in a way of like jurisprudence in a way that ultimately reflects multinational corporations, or what the international banking systems is, having fair use of the U.S. dollar, or controlling over the circuits and venues of commercial buildings as compared to methods of banking of like normally just Social Security Administration below business and corporate law of normally like family structure, whether or not if and most people even have participated receiving Social Security benefits, even know what family law really even is. I mean, for real, and knowing that much about degree level of like what real estate is to a neighborhood, or what non-negotiable, non-transferable itemization means. So maybe just a daily standard practice for like just going and after a work week and think about Friday and just sign a check, or if that's the excuse of what having fair use is, or the complement and privilege of a name and identity being increased, yet still, what's the real deal about? Regaining, I mean, is it regaining control of a name and identity, or is it like, like COVID ID 19, and like, it's just like, the alphanumerics of 72 and the categorization of money in the world, and what that really is, and in the way of like color and the brown thing, it's ultimately, whether or not if the deal about COVID ID 19 being 72 is ultimately getting to like a Hobsbawm deal of Geneva, Switzerland being a color code like onion rings in orbit, a Burger King deal about the kingsmanship and whether or not if jurisprudence is ultimately defining whether or not if the province is only an accusation, what annotation is to jurisprudence, or what annotation really is to a marginal spread beyond a tennis court, or if it's really the issue between a tennis court and baseball. The seams on a baseball and tennis ball are the shape like virtually identical. I mean, baseball in practical application, in principle, I mean, it ultimately gets to the Vantage Love 30 and the ground rule double. Like Vantage Love 30, like once again, it seems to be like, a demanded requirement to score 2 consecutive scores to even be allowed to score the winning run. I mean, the winning point being the 3rd consecutive of like Vantage Love 30 is like really the big deal about, that fact of like a mandatory requirement to win the game, of where that begins, about the mandatory requirement of 2 consecutive points to even be allowed to be eligible to score the 3rd winning point, beginning with like the Vantage Love 30 thing about tennis, or what that is to baseball with the ground rule double, or the practical application of a ground rule double, and the Vantage Love 30 thing about the alphanumerics of secret de facto being the terminology in alphanumerics of like the tennis score. There's some humor about the Houston Oilers being the color code black of oil. Well, naturally so. Moving to the Tennessee Titans, I mean, it seems to be like a real big deal about tennis and the Apple iPhone SE and the 10C and the SE being like a language deal of yes, and the vision deal of night vision, not limited to, or perfect 10-10 vision of the infinite lines, ultimately getting to the symmetrical asymmetrical thing about pi r squared and the exponential quotients. I mean, all that information. I mean, seemed to be. I went through computation, deciding what alphanumerics and linguistics really is about applying the principle, a practical application of integration of compatibility. I mean, that way in analytical. I mean, so much sometimes not even the word in any kind of way of analytical, beyond the linguistics. The study of language itself in that way, and the association of like definition as compared to the alphanumerics of the word itself, or the analytical of integration of like both, or I really get into it, and I really like studying that stuff, and I mean it's really kind of fascinating to me, really, but I mean it's like so seriously, and not funny. I mean I really do it seriously. I'm going a lot on my memory because I've really put many years in it, and I find interest in it that way. But really, I mean, all that stuff at the bank about having continual issues about who's in control of my account and what's the real deal? I should not have not ever a negative balance. I don't write any checks. I mean, anything, my checking account has been set up for more and still continually to where, there's not to be an overdraft in a way. And if the overdraft only suggests whether or not if the U.S. dollars, the accusation of like the note is legal tender for all debt, both public and private, or what that is to a rural route, or switching and routing of Cisco, of switching and routing, or what that is to a checking account, or the history of an address, or an IP address, or internet protocol in a way of a history of a mailbox, or what that is to my own humor about but hey, I have prepaid postage, and cumulative rollover, a little bit of humor. Yeah, something about, hey, yeah, yeah, for real. So, hey, in that way, so like really, what's the deal about, Wells Fargo? I mean, it's just a presidential reference to, presidents of like, the Capitol or, what's the real deal about, human capital way of the United States, or is it just English speaking or in translation, like, even religion suggests, involving, that fact of translation. I mean, ultimately, is it getting to whether or not knowing, a translation or the language itself is really the big deal? Of like whether or not the platform and architecture is the deal about embedding or encryption, or the four corners of the earth deal, and what the equator for real is, to like Europe and the deal about North America, or even region 1 and 0, a motion picture of the DVD and like motion picture in that way, or what poetic motion is. An audio production of waveform like of the thermocouple semiconductor, not having the full range of ambidextrous, anatomy in that way, or like a hotspot. What a hotspot is, in hardware as compared to software. The deal about software being like the thing about anatomy, as compared to like hardware of hubbing, of switching and routing. The same practical application of hardware of switching and routing. Of hardware is the same principle of like hubbing, a hub, switching and routing to get to the fastest destination, and yet completely the same practical application and principle, yet completely opposite of a node. It doesn't switch. It's like dissipating, by switching and routing of hubbing of hardware. Yet in software, a node is like a hotspot, and anything going through it isn't going to be switched or routed. It's just going to go through it. And the deal about it getting a hotspot is that there's so much traffic that way that's identified in networking as a node of a hotspot. What would be hardware, like dissipating, a congested deal or a hotspot, like switching and routing is to hubbing, or the term even used in space exploration. I mean, for real, even NASA that way of the space Hubble, or what hubbing is to networking, I mean, for real, and the deal about software, as compared to, what the U.S. dollar is to maybe what sole proprietor would only mean as a podcast, or whether or not thou shalt not bear graven images is only not defining the meaning with the FDIC, or the FDIC casting accusation that there's like a UFO like in everyone's wallet, okay, and bearing the graven image of the U.S. dollar, and like it's like litigation and a breach of national security even have it anywhere near your ass finishing the finish line, demeaning the value of the United States and retroactive presidential administration. I mean, who's anyone trying to kid at this point? I mean, for real. And what the U.S. dollar is, and what commercial paper is, as compared like a check from an employer, or the degree level of an associate's not even being employed as a description of employers. I mean, many people might confuse what employer is or is not, even at associate's level, because it's really not even the minimum requirement of a major university of a minimum of a bachelor's. And normally the next thing beyond a bachelor's of a 4-year degree is a 6-year degree of a PhD, a mandatory deal about in my thought. I'm not sure if it's limited to medical medicine and medical technology of chemistry. I'm not sure if a PhD is anything other than medical, or what it is to a hospital of a living quarter, or what a bicentennial is or is not to a commercial venue. Defining what a fixture is in real estate as compared to like a neighborhood of residential as compared to a fixture in real estate being a venue of a commercial living quarter, a commercial building. And so like I'm all about like living, like yeah, and having my like music video business and like everything about like music video business. And I don't know if I would use the thing word business at this point because of many things that seem to be like really the deal of whether or not if a venue is really only an issue of like whether or not if a corporation represents the alphanumerics of 144 and the deal about Zion, 1,000 years of peace, and thou shalt of 10 commandments, or what the Ten Commandments is that way of 1,000, and Grover Cleveland of the U.S. dollar as a minimum requirement of separation between church and state. That way, what corporation ultimately, represents in the alphanumerics of, 144 of the word itself, corporation, or what that is to the 12 tribes of Israel. I mean, ultimately, it's 144,000, 12,000 in each of the 12 tribes. I mean, ultimately, it's really getting, really symbolically of the 10 Commandments and the 1,000 thing of like Zion in combination with that fact about religious thing all the way up to the 12 Federal Reserve Banks, the 12 tribes of Israel. I mean, ultimately getting to electronic power and the 12 volts of direct circuit, and what the DC is to Washington DC, that way of direct circuit, or duration of circuit, or what that is to intellectual. The word seems to be pretty much about duration of intellectual property, the way of royalties, and what duration means to lifespan. Normally it's associated in law of intellectual property, and normally involving like entertainment law of compact disc. Normally, according to what I've seen, the thing about intellectual property is normally associated with the lifespan. In audio production with a compact disc of like musicians, it's like an automatic 50 years of royalties, and normally that is phrased as a duration of lifespan of the royalties of like an easement of like intellectual property of like a compact disc or a DVD. And normally that phrase in law involving intellectual property of royalties, normally of entertainment law, is not limited to, or what that is to a name and identity, with a claim like of one's own name and identity, what it means and what kind of value you feel, the deal about, even the Heather Locklear thing, the I'm worth it thing, was a big deal about the shampoo. I think it was Willa Balsam likewise, and they took two friends, and so on and so on. I'm not sure if it was the Willa Balsam. It was like Heather Locklear. I'm not sure if it was the Willa Balsam thing. I'm trying to remember, but it's shampoo. And it's something about the truth and the 87 thing, and like, a miracle God thing and all that stuff about truth. And maybe, even, the big deal about a quarterback being predominantly 12. I mean, ultimately, the quarterback is ultimately, the quarter in my mind of what seems to be going on to the tricentennial of a 300-year celebration, or what TriStar is in that way, or the bicentennial quarter of a bicentennial deal, and the operator, and Chevrolet, and God, the operator itself, and the zero being 64 and HTTP, and Zion at the 1,000-year deal about all this stuff I'm talking about. Anyway, yeah, this is already going on. God, like a minute, and, an hour and 18 minutes here, and about 5 seconds here. But anyway, I think I'm gonna go ahead and take a break because really I could probably go on for like weeks, day and night for real about all this stuff. I mean, it's so not limited to what I'm talking about, but I'm really seemingly, having the thing about the, just, feeling the need to, but really I'd like to be making music video and getting my original music and all about that commercial venue. And hey, how about that Hill HX-50, like horizontally propelled aircraft, that helicopter thing about the Hill HX-50 helicopter. I was like, real cool. So anyway, that'd be like real cool about, what platform is the architecture of. Two of them, like two big ones, yeah. Anyway, so real. Man, that Vision's like high-rise building, 75-floor high-rise Vision's tower building. Yeah, and all that stuff about, Airmark Arena, and Highway 288 and all that, like building the future, and not limited to, yeah. Anyway, so like great. Anyway, I'm gonna take a break, and I'm going to maybe, do what it is that I do. Okay, so anyway, I'll talk to you later. Okay.